I formed the foundation in 2009, and the idea came from all the work I did on Alzheimer's and other rare diseases, where we saw all these difficulties in getting through the regulatory process and developing the product. And I felt must do better than that. And we were trying to accelerate more biotech and innovation in rare diseases. And we wanted practical and scientifically sound things. We just didn't want any drugs through that didn't do anything, but there was a way to do smart changes to the system, not break it all up and throw it away, but things you could do that were practical and sensible that would improve the process, and we thought we should put those forth from what our own experiences have been. We put our statements for belief here are that no disease is too rare to deserve treatment. I think that's a fundamental truth, and that we do believe that all the drugs should be safe and effective, and we just have to figure out how we do that. And we do also believe that there's a lot of good science out there that hasn't been translated, and we could be doing more with it if we had the process working better. There's certainly lots of roadblocks in the pathway, and I probably don't want to go through all of it, but many diseases are just so rare, or their biology is so complicated and unusual that just the system doesn't really work for them. And there's often those diseases have no defined regulatory path, which means we have this drug that works, let's say, in a model in a research lab, but how do I get that into the clinic and actually approved? How do we work through that process when no one's ever studied it before? There's no endpoints, there's no markers, there's no history at all, and the system doesn't work for those diseases very well, and that's one of the biggest problems. The expectations also are extremely high. That is, the expectations for investment required to get a drug approved are extreme, and for Alzheimer's, it ended up costing, for MPS I, more than $100 million invested. There's only 200 patients or something on therapy in the United States. $100 million developed for 200 patients on therapy. Well, if that's the system and that's the approach, well, how are we going to treat everything? We're never going to have that spend that much money on so many drugs. I mean, it's never going to work. It's just not practical. We have to think of better ways to get these drugs through, and we'll talk a little about some of the things we've been doing to show that and how that might improve. And so right now, many diseases are left without any investment. I'm sure some of you know those diseases, and you're here for that reason, and we think we can do better. So, when we were looking at what's been going on, I think you heard today about the HIV drug development example and the AIDS activists, and they certainly were able to make change at the FDA. It was very virulent and it was very antagonistic, but they did something important, which is get the accelerated approval rules through, and those approval rules dramatically improved HIV treatment. It said, look, everything's not perfect, but if something's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, let's put it on the market because people are dying. And there was this fear that somehow we do bad things. But what ended up happening is it opened the door to investment. The drugs got out, and then other companies look at those drugs and say, we could do better. Here's how to make it better. Here's how to make it better. And very soon we had a whole series of drugs, 29 drugs, and so many different mechanisms of action combining to create highly active retroviral therapy, which is the cornerstone of how they treat HIV. But you can't get 4 drug combinations developed in that time frame without having accelerated approval. We'd like to see that for the rare disease community, but that all started because someone opened the door and said, you know what, a white cell count, that's good enough to show this drug's doing something meaningful. It didn't cause bad drugs to get developed, but it did open the door to getting investment that led to better and better drugs over time, the evolution of medical care. For many of our diseases, there's not going to be the one-shot cure where you just one thing and it's all fixed, right? It's an evolution. You get the first drug out, you try to make it better, and on it goes. So trying to move this vision of improving rare disease to reality, we basically tried to work on science-driven public policy, and I didn't want to only do policy, we want to do science. So we initiated a workshop series where we talk about particular issues. We engage FDA. The conferences, the workshops are free, and we primarily fund them, although we've been gotten some support now in the last few times. We pull basically FDA, academics, industry together, and we talk about the details of how to do drug development in a conversational workshop setting. We also have certainly organized in the patient groups to try to get them understanding what are some of the regulatory issues. I think many people feel there's something wrong with the process, but they didn't know what, and I think we were trying to provide essentially an agenda for what we could be doing. The other thing, of course, is what we did is we launched the Cure the Process campaign, which gave a focal point to the work we were going to do. Now, the name Cure the Process, when we were looking for a name to try to brand the campaign, I thought Cure the Process sounded right. It's not Cure the FDA, by the way. It's Cure the Process. The FDA is part of the process, but we're part of the process. The companies are part of the process. So it's kind of it's how the system works. And everyone's trying to do what they thought they're supposed to be doing. The question is, how can we make it better? We launched it in May 2009. It hasn't been that long. It hasn't been that long since we launched the campaign at that summit. And I gave the talk in front of a group of senior FDA people, and they'd not heard this before. And I could hear the seats cringe and the sort of moving around going on behind me, and the discomfort, because no one says anything that's critical of FDA in a public forum. And I was not trying to be critical of the FDA exactly. I was trying to say critical of what was happening. And the question to the audience really was, is this what we want? Is this the way this played out with Aldurazyme? Is that what we're looking for? Are we looking for delays, people dying, programs canceled, too much money spent, and in the end a product approved? That could be considered a success, but I'd say, how about all the people that didn't make it, or all the drugs that didn't get developed? So I think there was lots that could be improved. So with the campaign itself, these were the original goals. We wanted to do something to improve specialization at FDA, which we talked about developing a new Office of Drug Evaluation. The concept was, it wasn't solving all the rare diseases, but we said, let's create a new model for a review division of people that really were trained in the medicine area from which the drug and the patients come from, right? And one of the challenges is that the FDA is short-staffed. They don't have enough people from specialized areas. So we said, let's create a new organization, create more specialization. Secondly, we wanted to create qualification criteria to allow more accelerated approval, more use of biomarker endpoints to get drugs that are very difficult to study diseases approved. And thirdly, we want to talk about how do you do clinical development? How do you study rare diseases? The traditional designs work for big market diseases. They don't really work on rare diseases. And so we wanted to have additional study designs and analysis techniques that were powerful. Now, there's different ways of approaching these three goals, and we did different tactics for each one. But very importantly is we had 181 organizations sign on formally to support the campaign, and that support helped us in a lot of ways at various places through the campaign. So I want to thank all of you for that support. Now, campaign milestones, I won't go through all of these, but we did a lot of testifying, a lot of talking on the Hill. And the political, battles began quite quickly. You go out and say what you mean, and then other people try to reinterpret what you said. But I think what's key for us is we kept to a set of 3 goals. We said the same thing, and we said it over and over again to help drive forth what we meant. And we made it very clear what our real goals were, which were more safe and effective drugs for rare diseases. Now, we did host the workshops as well. We published a paper on accelerated approval and why it's so beneficial. And what we said is that if you could get accelerated approval working correctly, that for every $1 billion invested, we could get 36 drugs for rare diseases developed, as opposed to 10 or 11, which is currently what's happening. And I think getting 3-fold more drugs developed for the same investment is what people want, because there's a limited amount of money, and why not get more drugs developed for that same investment? So we showed how the benefit of policy toward the system of drug development. Now, 2 of the campaign goals were included in FDA's Brownback-Brown report, which is them a look at themselves of what they could do in rare disease, which I thought was a victory if they were acknowledging that 2 of our goals were, in fact, their goals as well. And fundamentally, I think the biggest important one is inclusion of ultra-fast in the FDAsia that was signed last year in 2012. I think that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit right now. Now, you might wonder what... didn't go. All right. So ultra-fast sounds kind of funny, like we planned that out. But we started with a bill called ULTRA, which is intended to improve access to accelerated approval for rare diseases. And we evolved that into what was the next bill, which was FAST. And FAST was the language that ultimately got included in FDAsia. But the concept here was, let's try to improve, let's ask of rare diseases what they can actually collect on their diseases, and not expect them to collect things that they never have, like 20-year-long outcomes studies. No one has that. It never will. So, but the science sometimes is really good. So why not give them credit when the science is good and allow, adapt the accelerated approval process to meet the needs of rare diseases? And that's at the fundamental core of it, to help improve access to accelerated approval. Now, ultimately, when these bills passed, there was quite a political thing going on, and Washington is a tough place, and people were saying if you want a friend, bring a dog, and then, in Washington. And then I heard, no, you need 2 dogs because one of them might turn on you. So we immediately found all interesting, and some of the problems came actually from other rare disease groups, which was unexpected. But we kept to our message. We talked incessantly with staffers and on the Hill, tried to maintain good relationships, you just heard in the last section. And also we adapted. We heard complaints, and we evolved language and accepted changes to find our way through to a point that would give us what we needed, but at the same time would accommodate. And that's a political part of the compromise process to getting through. We didn't just say, here's what it is and tough. We said, all right, what are your issues? And we negotiated and worked our way through. But we got language that we think was very important and very valuable, and we're certainly happy. Now, I want to thank all of you, because what happened is when things went south or when there was trouble with anyone, we put out action alerts, and we had a firestorm of activity when we did that, and we appreciate all of you signing up, lettering, and Facebooking your friends. And when we pulled the trigger on action alerts, they learned about this in Washington. We were shutting down an office, the whole switchboard shut down with calls, and that happened several times, and we got a reputation as having some serious political firepower, and that's all because of you, so I want to thank all of you. In January, we first started getting the bill in. We were given 0 chance by all the people, all the insiders in Washington. But I'm Greek, so I'm used to impossible tasks. And I figured we're going to work this as well as Washington can work it. And we pulled out all the stops, all actions. And I think that surprised people how much we had going on to get it happening. But all of you were one of that secret weapon. And there was one point in the bill when the Senate dropped their version of the bill that didn't have our language in it. We said, well, we're going to show them that's not acceptable, even though they were supposed to. We put out an action alert to them. About 2 hours in, on the several Senate members, 2 hours in, I got a call in California early in the morning saying, these staffers want to talk to you. And they said, look, we'll talk. Can you call this off? Because we're just, they were dying. And we called it off. It took time, though. Actually, you guys were so aggressive that it actually kept going on. We couldn't exactly pull it back so quickly. But that changed things for us, and we were able to get the bill in on the conference committee ultimately. So it's a long process. You do have to maintain good relationships, but you also have to show people you mean business, and that's what putting the group together was able to do. So one of the things that we appreciated from Senator Stearns was that is his recognition of our work on this. And I put this up not to beat our own drum, but on the Hill, they're recognizing that there's constituencies now in the rare disease community that are different, that are helping do practical and intelligent things. And we were able to help his bill and Senator and Representative Towns, their bill basically sail through. And for many of them, it was a really successful thing to do in a Congress that was so divisive. And so we were pleased to get that recognition from Cliff Stearns. So what's next, though? And someone said, we heard, I think, last night about a bill gets passed, and then you say, and it's done. It's not done. First step, now follow-up. And so while the bill got passed, it asked for guidance from the FDA. But rather than wait for the FDA to issue the guidance, I had a workshop, and we're starting to write the guidance in a white paper format for them. Now, Janet Woodcock at FDA told me, if you do this, that will help you. It was done before by Friends of Cancer Research, so we're learning from their example. So we're going to write a white paper, which is basically a guidance. We're working that with a working group. I'm working on the draft right now. Our hope is to put that out. We'll get that working group to come up with the first draft. We'll disseminate it more widely then, get feedback, make a second draft, and then have a workshop in May. This will include FDA's input, by the way, along the way. In May, we'll have a workshop to talk about that white paper, which will essentially, hopefully, to become a guidance. We'd present that to FDA and publish it. And our hope, since their deadline is July, that the easiest path forward in putting up a guidance would be to take the work we've put together and put it up for comment. And that's how we're going to help them get to the end. We're not doing something that's just a giveaway. It's intended to be rigorous, scientifically comprehensive approach to how to get more accelerated approvals forward without just any kind of junk coming through. So we want to do it right. We're not just doing it easy. But we think if we do it right, it will still open the door to more drugs getting through the process. So that's where we're going. We're having that workshop May 15th, so if you're interested in accelerated approval, come and hear what's going on. Now, one of the things that's important in making this all work is that for those of you who don't understand the process, you have to go eventually talk to FDA and say, I want a biomarker. The question is, when do you talk to them about it? In the usual pathway, it's at what's called an end of phase 2 meeting, which means you've already got the drug in development, you already developed manufacturing process, you already did toxicology, you already did a phase 1 study, you did a phase 2 study, you've spent $25 million. Now you're going in and saying, hey, I'd like a biomarker to get through. But the problem is none of you have $25 million to get to that stage. In order to get the company to get someone to invest in your disease, you kind of have to know before you get there if the surrogate was going to work. So there has to be a process earlier, a step earlier on at a pre-ND stage before you've spent millions of dollars that says, look, the science is there to back this surrogate for this ultra-rare disease. This is a situation where we need one of these, and we have to fix that. Now, I recently, at my role at a company, Ultragenyx, we went to FDA with a new biomarker for a ultra-rare disease, 200 patients in the world, sort of a test case. And they said, well, their biomarker qualification process doesn't really allow for individual drugs to come through. And so I told them, so then you want me to wait until end of phase 2? And Mark Walton, the other, said, yeah, I guess that's a problem. And I said, yeah, it's a problem, Mark. So he said, let me think about it. But at least he was recognizing that the way they're doing it now doesn't make any sense. So hopefully we will also build that into what we do with the guidance. Certainly, although it's the accelerated approval pathway and FDAsia is a great start, there is more. We still think these are 3 goals that we're still continuing with. We're calling them Cure the Process Campaign 2, but we need to have still the increased specialization in drug reviews. That part we haven't given up. It's been hard to do, and in a sequestration environment, hard to talk about. At some point, it needs to happen. Specialized review is needed. We think that rationalizing safety requirements is another issue, and the reason that's becoming such an issue is so many drugs, rare disease drugs, are going overseas initially, and they spend time overseas because of a different environment. And then all the U.S. patients can't get involved, even though the U.S. science came from the U.S. and the drug companies in the U.S. And that just is untenable as a situation. And we need some harmonization with what the guidelines suggest, and that the U.S. may need to apply those the same. So we think some improvement is needed there. We also think there are probably some additional incentives that are needed as well. So I don't want to spend too much time on the... hello. There it is. Okay. So one of the things I want to talk about is certainly the review decisions. I won't talk a great deal about this, but if you don't have specialized people who really understand your disease, it's very hard to get them to understand how to interpret information. And I've had 3 product approvals, biochemical genetics, and I've never had anyone that actually was trained in biochemical genetics on any review at any point in time. I've had family practice doctors, I've had neurologists, I've had some nephrologist, a pulmonologist. None of those patients people had ever seen. The only time they heard of those diseases was in med school. That's just hard. I mean, that's just, how can they learn and regulate a drug? It's a really hard job they have to do. It is extremely hard, though, to kind of step in and take a complex biochemical genetic disorder that you don't know anything about. You've never seen a patient before, you never managed anyone, and now try to make decisions on how drugs work and what to make of the endpoint. So we think that's something that needs to happen. It's something we continue to work with, and the needs of increasingly complex rare disease, therapeutic areas are needed. We need to be able to do something. They need to handle that. Now, we presented last year to Margaret Hamburg a concept that what they need to do is create more new ODEs, or Office of Drug Evaluation. This is a structure of the review divisions, and that you should have some really more specialized review divisions like biochemical and genetic disorders or pediatric neuromuscular disorders. Like Duchenne is not the same as Alzheimer's, yet they're in the same place right now. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's a totally different group of doctors that treat those diseases. They should be in separate groups. And so what we're trying to say to them, they need to specialize these review groups and get people trained in the fields. It's a basic concept. Nowhere in the world would you go into a hospital and they'd have the wrong doctor trained in the wrong field, licensed and practicing to treat you for that disease. But somehow in the drug review process, as long as you're an MD, you're through. And I think that needs to change. It's not because they don't want to, but the problem is that they've not been able to do it, and I think they need to get the incentive to do it. The rationalizing of safety requirements, I think, is also extremely important, and we all want safety, and we want safe drugs, but a lot of our kids are, these diseases are dying all the time, right? We're dying already, so we know what the issues are, and waiting a year, 2 years, 3 years for or losing the opportunity to involve in study is a life, or death decision. So we need to do better on rationalizing safety guidelines. I won't go more into that, just to say that there are ICH guidelines. They apply them in the UK better, and I have to admit that our program for MPS 7, Algenetics, is starting in the UK. And I had to, because we can get into the clinic there 9 months sooner than the US, maybe 9 months to a year sooner. So I can sit and wait, or I can get going. And so we're starting. But unfortunately, that happened to us for the Morchio program at BioMarin. It's happened to a number of companies, Sanfilippo studies, some Duchenne studies. It shouldn't be. It should be available to get in the US, and there's kids that need it here too. So one of the things that we think is also important is new incentives. And one of the things that we were thinking about, and particularly when I hear about pediatric cancer situation and the lack of investment in pediatric cancer, is that there are so many large market drugs that are getting approved, but those companies don't want to invest in very rare diseases. They don't want to take that drug and try it out in pediatric cancer, or if it's a large market cancer drug, because something bad could happen, and there's zero economic incentive to do it. However, we think there's a way, the way to change that situation by creating incentive. And the question is, what could we do? And one of the things that we are thinking about is is the idea is a patent term extension for rare disease indication. So if you, let's say, have a drug approved, Avastin, for a big cancer indication, you have no interest in taking a risk for a couple hundred kids with peds cancers of various types. However, if you gave them a patent term extension on their overall market, that's very valuable. But what you'd say to them is, look, if you do the proper development, the dose studies, the clinical studies, invest in it and get your pediatric cancer indication, let's say, on the label, right? We'll give you 2 months extension for each indication you add on. And you can add 3 on and get 6 months. So now you take the company that knows the drug, knows how to do the drug development, right? They've got the money, they've got the resources. You get them with that drug they've already just gotten approved, and you put them in play. Now some real firepower, and you'll see them investing now where they had been afraid to do anything. And I think that will greatly change the economics, and you'll see we have 24 drugs a year, not for orphans. Imagine that each of them had patents that could get extended, and they invest in 5 or 6 indications, maybe get 2 or 3 on a label. Suddenly, that's now 60 drugs in development that weren't really in development for other indications. Could really charge up the investment in rare disease, and I think it would be particularly good for cancer, where there's many drugs that are not been developed. So I won't go more into that now. We can talk about it later, but it's an idea we're talking about right now. Is an idea that would be relatively simple to do, and I think would have a dramatic impact on investment in rare diseases. Now here's the kicker, the good part. Because the pricing is based on the large market indication, these orphan drugs would basically get pricing that was already out on the market for the large market. So they wouldn't necessarily be the ultra-orphans, very expensive pricing, right? They would be the pricing of the market that already is out there. So the benefit is those drugs that get approved would not have to be extremely expensive to accommodate custom drug development. They would be priced the same way as the large market drugs. So we get more drugs that are actually more cost efficient in development, and their costs for patients would not be necessarily higher. They'd be the same as all the large market. So that's leveraging our investment in large market disorders and getting more drugs developed. So we think if the pathway was more, certainly if the pathway is more predictable, we think we can get much more investment in startups. And we think large companies could take on more difficult biology if they had these patent extensions potentially. And we think ultimately we would see more approvals for rare diseases. And we think this is a way to get a win-win-win situation with patients, companies, and the economy benefiting from investment and treatment for your diseases. And so that's certainly our hope going forward. And certainly, thank you for your time.